So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Schwartz, County Manager. I wanted to welcome you to this public session for a discussion with the Police Practices Group, the subcommittee on the Civilian Review Board. Just as a quick reminder to everybody, beginning in July, we selected a 15-member group, which is looking at a series of issues. We have, while the group has been getting together, and there are 4 subgroups looking at a range of issues, including the role of the police and mental health services, traffic enforcement, also alternative dispute resolution, and then tonight's topic, which is a police civilian review board. Not whether we should have one, but rather what type and how should we approach it. So the 15 members of the group, several of them who are here today. Rodney Turner chairs the subcommittee involved with that, and he'll introduce the members of the group. We'll be taking questions from the community tonight and providing some further detail. So without further ado, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rodney for introductions. Rodney? You're on mute, Rodney.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good afternoon to everyone. Sorry about that mute faux pas. So as Mark mentioned, my name is Rodney Turner, and I am a chair of the Subcommittee on Civilian Review Boards and a member of the larger Police Practices Group. With us today, we have members of the Police Practices Group, members of the subcommittee, and we have 2 guests who will be presenting to us. One is Mr. Brian Corr, who is the former immediate past president of an organization called NACOL, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And we have Mr. Chief Kenton Rainey, who is currently the chief of the University of Chicago's Police Department, but has worked in a number of different departments and has observed a number of different models of civilian review boards. Just by brief introduction, our subcommittee, or the PPG, and by extension the subcommittee, was given one charge by the county manager and the county board. It was to determine what type of civilian review board Arlington should adopt if it chooses to adopt. So we were not here to ask or determine whether one was needed. We were here to determine if we have one, what it should look like. And so our process has been to basically go through and assess the different models to figure out which models or combination of models would best fit Arlington and its needs. Before we get started, however, I want to introduce my fellow subcommittee members, and I will ask them as I call your name to please come on camera and just show your face. First, if Kent Carter is here, please, Kent, if you're available, jump on camera. He's not available. Let's move on. We have Captain Latasha Chamberlain, who's a captain with the Arlington Police Department. Latasha, are you available? She's here. She can't jump on, apparently. Okay.
She's there.
She's here.
Can you not see me, Rodney?
Cannot see you.
Okay. I will try to work on that.
There you are. Looking official and everything. There you go. We have Miss Kim Phillip, a founding member of the Arlington for Justice organization. Kim?
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Cannot see you. There you go. And we have Saul Reyes, executive director of Bugata. Saul.
Hello, good evening. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And then once again, it's me, Rodney Turner. And so without further ado, I want to have Mr. Corr start with his presentation. Once again, he is immediate past president of NACOL, and he is an expert on the different models of civilian review boards that exist in the United States. And he can give us an overview of those models. Mr. Corr, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Turner. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to present to the full Police Practices Group. Again, my name is Brian Corr. I live and work in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I'm the director of our city's Civilian Oversight Agency. And as Mr. Turner mentioned, I'm on the board and am the immediate past president of NACOL. So I have, over the last 9 years, had an opportunity to work with people all over the country in my role as a board member, helping communities think about oversight, create oversight, revamp oversight, and really just look at how we can ultimately improve relationships between our police departments and law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve. So to begin, I am going to do a PowerPoint. So the test in our pandemic is, can we get the technology to work? So it looks like I got it to work so far. So again, that's me, Brian Corr from NACOL, and I'm talking to you in Arlington County, Virginia. So again, very happy to be here. So the first thing I want to do is to say a little bit about where this all comes from. And in the current moment, we have heard a lot of conversations about the origins of policing, the roots in slavery, which there's a lot of truth in that. And I'm going to share a little bit about that, as well as what the standard narrative has been. I'm not going to read this whole slide. I will make them available so people can look at them later. But basically, what this slide is talking about is the idea of small towns and villages where a constable, a sheriff is coming around to talk to you, check in on you, watch, keep the peace. And that is a true part of the origin of policing in the United States. But it's not the only part of the story. One thing that's really important to know, and again, I think many people have heard about this, is the slave patrols and the roots of policing in slave patrolling. I will read this just because it's brief. This is a slave patroller's oath from just less than 2 centuries ago. I do swear that I will, as searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my power, so help me God. So this is an oath to the supreme being about you're going to go out and catch those slaves, and that's your duty. So this is part of the history. And then another piece back to England, which you will hear about a lot, and again, is an important part of the story, but not the whole story, is the formation of the Metropolitan Police in London in 1829. Sir Robert Peel, the minister responsible for it, later went on to become prime minister. He probably didn't come up with all of these ideas himself personally, but he worked with people. They created a model looking at history and what would make sense for their community. London, at the time, one of the largest cities in the world. And this idea that the police are the public and the public are the police is very foundational to a lot of the science of policing in this country. And there is absolute truth in this. But there is truth in all of these origin stories. So as we think about where policing came from, it informs our understanding of civilian oversight. And I would put to you these 3 simple principles: that some form of civilian oversight is important to strengthen trust with communities, that every community needs to define it in the way that works for that community, what is the best fit, and ultimately that civilian oversight is not enough. It's important. I would say it's necessary, but it's insufficient. But without it, it can be very difficult or possibly even impossible for the police to maintain the trust of the public they serve. And an important aspect of all this is when we think about civilian oversight, often people think about prosecution of misconduct. And it's very important to address misconduct. But there are lots of things beside misconduct. There's training, there are policy issues, and there are things that are, as it says here, lawful but awful. The police officers, they followed their training, they followed the proper procedure, but the outcome is one that is not suitable. Maybe it's not suitable for that individual. Perhaps it's not suitable for the entire community. So it's one thing when something goes wrong to look at what happened. But if you want to think about policing in a way that is responsive to the needs and desires of the community, you want to do front-end accountability. Back-end accountability is when things go wrong. Front-end is figuring out how do we create the kind of policing we want. And I will come back to this in a little bit, but procedural justice is a key concept for law enforcement and also for oversight. And it's often much more important that people feel that they're treated in a way that is just than the actual outcome of the interaction. So more to come on that. The roots of a lot of what we're looking at today have been addressed repeatedly over the decades, going back well over 100 years to reports at the turn of the last century. But one of the most important things that has come out in the last few years is President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing and the report that they put out. They looked comprehensively at policing, and they had a range of stakeholders from academics, Assistant Dean of Yale Law School, Tracy Mears, to police chiefs like Charles Ramsey from Philadelphia, and actually served in many cities, and people from Black Lives Matter, people from community organizations, and it was an amazing set of work that they did. So everyone should check it out. There's a link there. You can still find it on many websites, including the Department of Justice. But there were 6 pillars. The one I will focus on will be, again, very briefly, policy and oversight. But I will say that trust and legitimacy, community policing and crime reduction, officer training and education, officer safety and wellness, all very key in terms of transforming policing and then building trust and legitimacy, as well as technology and social media, all have an important role to play as we look to create policing that is what we expect in our cities and towns. One key quote from this report, from the executive summary in the policy and oversight section, is that policies must reflect community values, that law enforcement agencies should collaborate with community members. And that's exactly what's happening in Arlington County, Virginia. So you are on the right track. I think you don't need me to say that, but it's important to know that from the way we're looking at transforming policing in this country, it's very important that the community is part of that conversation at every step. And then I won't read this whole thing, but we were very excited that NACOL was actually mentioned in the implementation guide as part of the role of civilian oversight. There's a brief description here, which I will say a little bit more, so I don't need to read this to you, but just know that civilian oversight is now recognized by people at the federal level, even with the change in administration, as something that is important and necessary as we work to improve policing in our nation. So I said I would come back to procedural justice. It's really this idea that's tied to legitimacy. So legitimacy, I'll say a little bit more about in a moment, is really this idea of why do we believe that the police should be doing what they're doing if we do? And it's largely informed by procedural justice, that people have a voice, they can participate in decision-making, that those they're interacting with are neutral, it's unbiased, people are trustworthy, that the quality of treatment is one that involves dignity and respect for them as a human being on that very basic level. And finally, that you can trust those people who are doing law enforcement. But again, I want to emphasize that all of these principles are equally true for civilian oversight. And as we do our work investigating complaints, reviewing complaints, making policy recommendations, all of those principles have to be part of the work. And our stakeholders include the community, complainants, elected officials, appointed officials, community organizations, and of course, the law enforcement agency and police officers. Those are all stakeholders that need to be treated in a way that is procedurally just. I won't say much about this, but just know that as a national organization, which I haven't said much about, NACOL, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, has members from across the country and, in fact, members internationally. people who are involved in the work of civilian oversight as staff like myself, people who serve on oversight boards and commissions, people who are involved in internal affairs and professional standards on the law enforcement side, people who are monitors of consent decrees. And as an organization, we represent well over 1,200 people involved directly in this work. And we really mandate, to the extent we can, that everyone involved in oversight follow these principles in the Code of Ethics. Again, I won't read them. They're on your screen. They'll be available. They're on our website. But just know that we take this very seriously, that we are here to be ethical, to improve policing, to support communities, and to do things in a way that is just and ethical. And there are a few things that are important for civilian oversight to do. Before I get into this discussion about the models, I just want to say, again, I won't read through all this, but establishing credibility is a very important part of civilian oversight. There are expectations of oversight that, as NACOL, we would say are important and reasonable, fair expectations that people involved in the work, staff, board members, volunteers, are familiar with police practices and policy. They're impartial and objective. They will meet with and communicate effectively with police departments and their staff. They will follow all confidentiality laws and evidentiary standards, and they're really willing to consider all sides of a situation and to be impartial and fair. And I really want to emphasize this because this can be an area of confusion, because in most places, not every, civilian oversight exists because of official misconduct, because there have been problems, because people may have seen patterns for decades. And there's a way in which it can be easy to say, well, oversight should be taking the side of the community against the police. Now, the bigger picture may be to transform policing, to change policing, to make it more responsive, to address misconduct and create justice. But in any given case, you still have to be impartial. So it's important to not forget why we're here, but also not lose sight of the need to be fair and impartial. Again, a lot of detail here. I won't get into all this just for the sake of time, but training and professional development is key. Training from the law enforcement agency that you're working with, training from NACOL and others who have expertise in civilian oversight. We do training all year long and have a big training conference and work with communities on a contract basis to help them as well, do training of new boards. So there are a lot of resources, but it's vitally important that training and ongoing professional development. It's not a once and done. It's just like many fields. There are always new things coming into the field, new ways of looking at things. You have to refresh your memory. So those are all very important. And so I pause to say, is civilian oversight the answer? Is it going to fix all of the problems in a community around policing, around racial disparities, around treatment of minorities and other vulnerable people? Well, it's not the answer. But again, it's not sufficient to gain legitimacy. But without it, especially in the current moment, it can be difficult, if not impossible, for police to maintain the trust of the public without civilian oversight. So I'm going to get a little bit more into the theory briefly, talk about the models, and move to closing this so that we can hear from Chief Rainey. But these three pillars of oversight I'm about to talk about: independence, transparency, and accountability. And I'm getting a little message that I have bad network quality, so hopefully this will still work out fine. So independence, again, I'm not going to read the slide because I hate going through presentations where people read the slide to you, then you can read it yourself. But the idea of independence is that this agency is part of the government, so it can have an impact and influence on the law enforcement agency and on the broader issues. But it has to be independent from our point of view of that law enforcement agency. It may work with very closely, but still need to report, say, in your case, perhaps to the county manager, just like the law enforcement agency does. And there, as it says here, are some examples. basically the idea of being able to get information out to people, make recommendations and make them public, and be able to control its own staff within that agency are all very important for independence. The next pillar, transparency, it's really a shared responsibility between the oversight agency and the law enforcement agency and the broader government. But again, without reading all these examples, the idea that people know what the agency is doing, they can trust that the agency is doing important work because it's reporting regularly. Every state has different rules, different laws. This is why no two oversight agencies are the same. But within your context, within your legal framework, it's important to be as transparent as you can be in order for the community and for the law enforcement agency to have trust in the work that's happening, for people to know what is the situation with complaints from the public. Not every place makes those public, but it's important that you do as much as you can. And again, some of this talks about tracking broader trends. I'll get into that a little bit more with the models, but to the extent possible, again, you don't just want to say, in this case, the officer A did something wrong. You want to say, we've noticed that there's a pattern of A, B, and C, and so we're proposing that training be changed. We're proposing that there's a policy that mandates or forbids a certain activity. So, and then the third one, accountability. I won't say too much about this because it's pretty obvious. And it's one of the things that people often will say, well, this is the goal, is to hold police accountable when they do something wrong. And that is an important part of the work. It's also important that police officers know that when they haven't done something wrong, that will be found as well. And that's just as important in order to make sure people understand that your agency is fair and impartial. So that's, again, accountability is a very important thing. And again, I won't read this one. Some good stuff here, but basically, it's just some thoughts as you think about how do you establish credibility? How do you, as a public servant working inside government, work effectively with all the stakeholders? And how do you make sure that you are always, in an ongoing way, competent to do the work that you've been tasked to do? So now I'm going to move a little bit into what civilian oversight looks like, which I know is the promised thing you're waiting for, I think, for many of you. So civilian oversight, in our definition, is any agency where you have people who are not part of law enforcement, they're not part of the law enforcement agency, that are involved in reviewing, investigating, monitoring individual complaints or generally police department practices. And that can be anything from reviewing investigations done completely by the law enforcement agency, by their internal affairs or
Brian, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I got a message saying that my microphone was muted. And can you still see the presentation? Okay, great.
Yes.
Living through the pandemic. So, basically, yeah, I lose my train of thought. But civilian oversight involves all of these different things. We have a fairly broad definition. If someone said to me, we're going to set up an advisory group to the chief that's just going to give the chief advice about, how to work with the community and ongoing issues, I probably wouldn't call that civilian oversight. But when you're looking at investigations, specific incidents, policy procedures, then you go into the realm of civilian oversight. So the models of oversight, there are three basic models that we often talk about, and a fourth, which is just the hybrid. So they're all relatively intuitive. So the review focus model, which is why so many people will talk about civilian review boards, is kind of what it says. You are looking at investigations completed by the law enforcement agency, and a board of residents appointed in whatever manner who have gotten training and are following all the different standards I mentioned, are reviewing and having input into It varies a lot by community. Sometimes it's input into discipline. Sometimes it's just advice to the police chief or city manager or county manager or mayor. Sometimes it's really putting out written findings. But having that review, being able to see what complaints are happening, being able to know for the broader community that there are people who are specially designated to look at these, who are not part of the law enforcement agency, can definitely increase public trust. And it tends to be one of the less expensive models because the staffing is generally limited to administrative support for that board or commission. In the investigation-focused model, that is, again, as it sounds, you have investigations that are conducted independently of the law enforcement agency. They're interviewing complainants, they're interviewing officers, they're reviewing computer-aided dispatch reports and other police reports. And again, depending on the area, the state, the laws, there may be some or no restrictions on what they're able to see. But then those investigators who have specialized training, they're not just kind of people off the street, but they're trained investigators, then make their findings. And again, it's often done with a civilian review board that is looking at those investigations and, again, making determinations. And that is often an area that people feel is necessary. I will just say on the front end of this that it really varies because depending on how many complaints you get and the size of your community, it may or may not make sense to have an investigator. But it's often something that communities say, I don't trust the police to investigate themselves. We need independent investigations. So that can be a factor in the effectiveness from the community point of view. And then the third sort of traditional model is the auditor or monitor or inspector general. Again, sort of self-explanatory in that it's somebody or an agency that is reviewing broader issues. They may or may not be looking at individual complaints, but they're looking at patterns. Say in New York City, when you had stop and frisk, there were multiple investigations, but you have an inspector general, which is separate from the Civilian Review Board in New York City. And the Civilian Review Board takes individual complaints. The inspector general looks at broad patterns. Again, in many cities, say Austin, Texas, for example, or Denver, Colorado, you have a monitor who is able to do those broad investigations and broad reviews of policy, and they also take individual complaints. So if it's only an inspector general, it probably won't involve the type of investigative staff or inspector general, auditor, monitor. But if you have a hybrid, which is what I've been kind of getting into, you can have elements that fit your community. And one of the first questions people ask me is, what's the best form of oversight? My answer is always, it's the best fit for your community, based on your laws, your history, the systems in your community, the things that you're able to do within state law, within municipal law, and it's ultimately what you can do is better than not doing anything in almost every case. But you really want to find something that works in your context and fits your community's needs and the expectations of your community. Just to wrap up quickly, I'm going to go through this very briefly. We are in the final stages of a report that was done as part of the 21st Century Task Force. We testified. One of their findings was there needed to be more research into effective oversight. We applied for a grant and got it, and we are now 4 years later finishing that up. It's been a very intensive process, and we did 9 case studies of cities around the country with different models. We're working, as I said, on this report of the state of the field. We're developing an updated decision-making guidebook on oversight and an interactive online toolkit so people can literally just go online, check out different models, kind of mix and match, see which places around the country are doing what, and then to help them as they're either thinking about their current oversight or they want to establish new oversight. Again, I won't read this all. You don't need to read it. But just to give you a sense of the range of communities that we looked at, including the one where I work, Cambridge, Massachusetts. So cities as big as Los Angeles and as small as Cambridge. A range of different models. The preliminary observations, some are obvious. Civilian oversight is a growing field. there's a lot more policy analysis than there used to be. And in general, part of what this is saying is that very often civilian oversight began as a reaction to a specific incident or a series of incidents. Increasingly, it has become something that communities are doing proactively. And I would say Arlington County is an example of that. So these are some of the observations we're going to be sharing when we finish the report. Yeah, I've said a lot of this already. And finally, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I've made this available to the working group, or the subgroup on civilian oversight boards. But the 13 principles of effective civilian oversight have really come out of years of our work and this research project. What we will always say is that, not all 13 of these will really apply in every single community because of the range of sizes. Columbia, Missouri is not really going to have the same system as New York City or Washington, D.C., but they also have civilian oversight. So really looking at these, figuring out which things you can do. Some are probably a little bit more important than others, but all of them are very important to the extent that they're applicable to your agency. And as you think about what works, these are the considerations we say. Is it an appropriate fit for our local context? How will this practice strengthen our civilian oversight in relation to the 13 principles of effectiveness? And very importantly, what are the potential unintended consequences of implementing this practice? I don't want to take up a lot of time. I could tell some stories. Maybe it'll come up in Q&A. But it's important to think about not just, here's what we're going to do that's going to be amazing and super strong, but what can we do that is going to work in the long term and is sustainable? So finally, I'd like to end with a couple of thoughts here. So as much as I'm talking about legal frameworks and accountability and all that, it's fundamental to remember that when you're talking about community, nothing about us without us is for us. So that community has to be at the center of these conversations, even as we figure out legal, governmental, financial, other frameworks to implement something. And another quote I love is, it's often attributed to a specific person, but that person has actually said, it wasn't me, this is what we talked about. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's from Aboriginal activists in Australia, in Queensland, in the 1970s. So this is my contact information. I'm fairly available. I try to be responsive. And again, this will be available publicly. So with that, I am going to end my presentations. If I can figure out how to stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Mr. Gore.
You're welcome.
And so, am I still on here? So we're going to now go to Chief Rainey. I know there are plenty of questions for Mr. Core. We're going to hold those questions until after Mr. Chief Rainey speaks, and then we'll ask both of our guests questions. Chief Rainey, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
The floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back with you again to speak on civilian oversight models. Again, I want to commend the subgroup for this work. It's very hard work, important work, extremely valuable and necessary work for law enforcement in the communities that we serve. And I will talk more about this later on in the presentation. Lynn, can you assist me again in advancing slides? I'm Chief Rainey, and I have 40 years of law enforcement experience. I've worked in 7 different agencies in 4 different states. I've been fortunate, privileged to have been selected as Chief of Police of 3 of those agencies. I've been involved in directly investigating, supervising, managing, or ultimately approving well over 1,000 personnel investigations. I'm a graduate of the Senior Management Institute of Policing, which is put on by the Police Executive Research Forum. there in the DC area. I'm a member of IACP, the International Association Chiefs of Police. I'm also a member of NOBO, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And I actually served as a NOBO fellow 1 year. NOBO is headquartered there in Alexandria, Virginia, where I actually was able to shadow Chief Charles Ramsey early in his tenure when he was Chief of Police of Washington, D.C., and he's arguably one of the best chiefs of our time. I've been selected twice as Officer of the Year in 2 different jurisdictions from citizens group, one for my advocacy for domestic violence and one for my advocacy for how law enforcement interacts with the mentally ill. Mr. Court did an excellent job in presenting the various oversight models, which make my presentation or my task a lot easier. But my first venture into police oversight was when I was a commander over a law enforcement academy that provided law enforcement pre-training and in-service training over 3 organizations in one of the 3 counties. And one of the participating law enforcement agencies that attended our academy had an officer-involved shooting. And there was a lot of questions regarding the training. And the grand jury actually came in and contacted me. And they wanted to know about our training curriculum, our training practices, the entire training platform, how many hours. They wanted to inspect facilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was my first venture into police oversight. And then when my second venture, when I worked in Dayton, Ohio, there was an actual formal citizens appeals board where the citizens had the ability to file complaints with the CAB, but the investigation was then transferred and completed by our department. The CAB would look at the investigation. They could request additional investigations, but they did not have the ability to overturn any findings or recommend any discipline. My next venture into police oversight was in the city of Fairfield, California, where we had a citizens complaint audit committee. And this committee was established in May and through the city manager's office. And we had a couple of citizens on there with city leadership. And they provided feedback after the fact regarding the quality of our investigations into citizens' complaint on a quarterly basis, but they did not overturn any findings or recommend discipline. However, because it was out of the city manager's office, I did interact with my city manager, who was my direct boss. He had any additional questions or concerns about how we did things. But again, it was after the fact. By far, when I worked for the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District, BART, that was the most robust citizen oversight that I experienced. We had an independent police auditor along with a citizens review board. They had the ability to do their own investigations. They had an investigator along with the auditor. They could challenge findings in real time. They made disciplinary and internal operational policy recommendations. And then the final model that I've experienced is the University of Chicago, where we have a civilian investigator that conducts investigations into citizens' complaints. They issue findings, make disciplinary recommendations, and we have an independent review committee made up of stakeholders on and off campus that review our investigations for thoroughness. I can say honestly that none of the oversight models that I've experienced that Mr. Court has talked about, because I pretty much have worked with them all now, has ever prevented me from being an effective leader or doing my job as a police chief. They certainly have made me more thoughtful and more thorough as a leader. And as everyone has seen, and we're going through this racial reckoning regarding how law enforcement is being perceived by the communities that we serve. This is why, as I stated previously, how important this work is that this committee has done, and whatever comes out of Arlington County, the importance of this work for you to be proactive, because it's usually not if you had any incident that you're reacting to, it's when, and you want to be proactive to prevent that when from when it occurs. We in law enforcement as leaders, we have been here before. These incidents that we have witnessed just this year on video, again, we've seen stuff like this before. And before there was a George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Jacob Blake, there was an Oscar Grant, Sandra Bland, and Eric Gardner. Next slide, please. And so in 2014, President Obama, reacting to some of these incidents, he commissioned a multidisciplinary task force that Mr. Cord already spoke about. It was much like this subgroup today to determine what best practices should be put in place by law enforcement in order to be efficient and effective for our communities in the 21st century. And, one of the things that President Obama stated in that report, and Mr. Cord put up the link, and if you haven't read it, I would suggest everybody take the time, just read the executive summary if you don't want to read the whole thing. But when any part of the American family does not feel like it's being treated fairly, that's a problem for all of us. And that's what we're experiencing, and that's what we're seeing today. Trust between law enforcement agencies and the people that they protect and serve is essential in democracy. It's key for the stability of our communities and integrity of our criminal justice system and the safe and effective delivery of police services. And so when you talk about trust, if someone says they don't trust you, what they're saying is they don't respect you. And so it's very, very important that we understand and respect each other's roles, and it's not just the police's responsibility for establishing public safety. Next slide. And out of that task force report, these listening sessions were commissioned across the country. And I was asked actually to come give testimony in one of the particular areas on technology and social media. My agency that I led was the first agency that implemented body cameras throughout the entire agency in the country, where we made it mandatory for all our personnel to wear body cameras when they were conducting their jobs. But I want to focus on Pillar 2, which is policy and oversight. Next slide, please. And as Mr. Cord already talked about policy and oversight, recommendation 2.8, some form of civilian oversight of law enforcement is important in order to strengthen the trust with the community. Every community should define the appropriate form and structure of civilian oversight to meet the needs of that community. And Mr. Cord is absolutely correct. There is no one size fit all. It's what that community feels comfortable with, working with all of the stakeholders as far as what they think they need in order to meet their expectations. Next slide. In my travels, speaking with my peers in various organizations or groups, this is what I've encountered, some universal themes regarding the reservation, restrictions of individuals, regarding the ideal of civilian oversight from the chief's perspective. We feel this is just another layer, another boss. We already work for either mayor, city manager, board of supervisors, city council, and bringing in a civilian oversight group is one more boss that we have to answer to. From the officer's perspective, they don't particularly care for civilian oversight because they don't feel that civilians can possibly understand the rigors of the day-to-day encounters that they have to go through. Activists, they don't trust civilian oversight because they see sometimes some activist groups that is just another form of government bureaucracy. And you have some activists who just want to do away with our entire system of government. From a political standpoint, politicians that I've spoken to, many of them run or maintain offices based on public safety. And ones who embrace civilian oversight risk opponents running against them who come in with a law and order mantra. And then costs. It can be costly depending on which model that you select. And there's always this looked at as an unfunded mandate. How are you going to pay for it? Next slide, please. And from my humble opinion, my perspective, police departments are paramilitary organizations, and this is my argument for civilian oversight, which I wholeheartedly support. And as paramilitary organizations, we're structured with the rank structure, policy and procedures, esprit de corps, just like our military. But each department of our military in the United States is headed by a civilian. When we talk about juries, civil and criminal proceedings, for us to take the position in law enforcement that civilians can't possibly understand what we do, the rigors, the in and outs, all the training that we go through and what we're confronted is just short-sighted from my perspective, because if we can't convince a civilian oversight group in a non-adversarial system, we will not be able to convince them in civil and criminal proceedings. I look at citizen oversight as another system of accountability that can assist me in help moving organizations forward and bringing them closer and more accountable to the communities that they're serving. And this helps build trust and legitimacy, which Mr. Court has already spoken extensively about. And as I said, when people say that they don't trust you, it's because they don't respect you. And by having civilian oversight, it establishes another layer of that can bring transparency and also innovation, depending on the oversight model that you select. If you select one, I know in my case, the more I learned about them, I was able to, it was easier for me to collaborate with them. And they brought unique perspectives, be it business, be it clergy, be it educators, just people from all different realms of life, the type of people who are going to end up on a jury in a civil or criminal proceedings. And they gave me great advice on things that I was trying to do with my organization as I tried to, again, lead it into the 21st century, when they bring that unique perspective of their discipline. Next slide, please. And finally, from a community policing standpoint, all law enforcement agencies today, they want to practice community policing. And community policing is a philosophy, a management style organizational design that promotes proactive problem solving and police community partnerships to address the causes of crime and fear, as well as other community issues. And where most law enforcement agencies, in my experience, fail to properly implement community policing is because they fail to understand, accept, and respect the various diversity of all their communities that they've been employed to service and protect. And the community partnership is so very, very important in that in order for us to understand, accept, and respect diversity, that we have to be culturally confident to go out and interact with whomever we serve, people who possibly are homeless, the people who are living in million-dollar homes. When we talk about community partnership, it's looked at as a flexible term referring to any given combination of neighborhood residents, schools, churches, businesses, community-based organizations, governmental agencies who work cooperatively in order to identify problems that impact the interests of all of us. Next slide, please. And when you successfully implement community policing style or philosophy throughout the culture of your organization, from my perspective, it makes civilian oversight, it only makes sense. It only strengthens the law enforcement agency. It makes it more forward-leaning, more forward-looking, and more responsive to the various communities that it's been employed service. Some of the things as you go down this road and making your decision that you may encounter or may not encounter, I've learned that Virginia is a right to work state, so you don't have to worry about necessarily a peace officer bill of rights. You have local ordinances that possibly could be changed or impact if you employ civilian oversight. Collective bargaining agreements need to be looked at, department policies, procedures, criminal versus administrative investigations, but the most important thing is the confidentiality. If you have a board, a civilian oversight board, that they understand the importance of the material that they have access to, that they can't, individuals can't run off and leak information to the media. They need to speak with one voice. Is extremely, extremely important so that they maintain trust, accountability, and legitimacy, not just to the communities that they're serving, but understanding that law enforcement and the law enforcement officers in that community are also stakeholders. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Chief Rainey. And so, as I said before, we're going to now open the floor to questions. I need you to first, of course, raise your hand virtually, given that we're using the Microsoft Teams app. And we will call on you, and once you're called upon, please come on camera and ask your question. All right. So let me go ahead and start, since, and I know there are questions out there. Let's get it warmed up here. So let me start with Chief Rainey, given that you are a longstanding police officer and police chief. Can you, from your perspective, share with us what elements, given that you've looked at different models or experienced different models, what elements of any civilian oversight that you found to be effective in partnering with your police officers or your police departments, and which elements do you find to be least effective or detrimental to that partnership?
That's a great question. And I'm going to come at it from each community, each individual community is different. And so from my perspective, they've all been effective. And what I mean by that is the stakeholders of that community, they have to be a part of the formation of any type of civilian oversight established by that jurisdiction. And this includes the police, and this includes the various activists or critics of the police. And by doing that, you have that what I refer to as creative tension, how you get to yes, and where everybody's not necessarily going to agree, but they certainly provide timely feedback in order to make the department better. from my perspective.
Thank you. And so just so the audience can know, we had the benefit of having you and Mr. Core here in the past, and that's what led us to having you to come for this learning session for the public, because we thought you were both insightful in your comments and the explanations of your perspectives and information that you share with us. And so we thought it would be helpful to the public to hear that as well. Mr. Core, you mentioned during your presentation that you yourself serve on a civilian review board in Cambridge, I believe. And can you give us a brief sort of summary of your experience in that review board? I mean, how long have you been on that review board? How many reviews have you been engaged in? And how that review board actually operates?
All right. Well, thank you. That's a great set of questions. So, so just to be clear for everyone, I am the director in Cambridge of our civilian oversight agency. So I'm not a member of our review board. We have 5 residents who are appointed by our city manager, and that's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's our model. All boards and commissions are appointed by the city manager. And I have been working in that capacity for a little over 10 years now. It's hard to believe. So I have, in that time, dealt with a number of complaints. In most cases, we act as a review agency. So I've had one case in particular that was a very lengthy investigation that I had to conduct myself. So we have investigative power. And when the board was established in the early 80s, that was really what the model was. And over the years, what really evolved was that it led to, in our case, and this is not true for everybody, but in Cambridge, it led to a lot of tensions. You know, we get relatively few complaints. You asked how many reviews I've been part of. I don't know off the top of my head, but we get about 10 complaints a year. And we're a city of 110,000, 115,000 people. Plus, we have 2 major universities, Harvard and MIT. We're sort of like Arlington. We're directly across the river from downtown Boston. So we're not a suburban community, but we're also not the city. And what I used to worry about, in fact, was that maybe we weren't getting complaints because people didn't trust us or because there were all these terrible things happening. In reality, we have a community that is not at all shy about complaining. And they're not complaining to us. They're not complaining to the police. They're not complaining on social media. They're not complaining to the city council. So long-winded way of saying we don't get that many complaints. And so our model works well for us. To have a full-time investigator would be rather odd. And I think one thing that often comes up that I don't think either of us has mentioned, the chief or myself, is subpoena power. So my agency has subpoena power. And communities all over the country, one of the first things I hear after a couple other things is, do you have subpoena power? Can we get subpoena power? We have to have subpoena power. In my experience, we haven't had to use it in well over 10 years, in my 10 years in the agency and a number of years before that. And the reason is that civilians have access to lots of things, but you may not be able to get a police department to comply, right? So if you have a subpoena, you can subpoena witnesses, you can subpoena video, you can subpoena records. One thing you can't subpoena in most cases is officers, at least especially the officers involved in an accusation of misconduct or improper procedure. And the chief could say this a lot better than I can, so I'll leave it to him. But there are some Supreme Court decisions and other rights, including constitutional rights, that don't allow a civilian oversight board to bring in the officers and kind of grill them under oath, the pains and penalties of perjury. So and this is to go back to my agency, we're discovering before I took over the agency, was that a lot of times officers would just come and they'd do this. And there was not much you could do about it. There are ways that police chiefs can order people to do things. That goes back to these constitutional rights. So we developed much more of a hybrid model that works for us very well. We have complete access to everything we need. The police department does the investigations in terms of interviews and reviewing files and things like that. It's still our investigation. Our board will ask them to come back and do more. And it's worked well for our community. We have really developed a relatively collaborative relationship We don't always agree. We're not always best friends, but we see that we have a common mission to make policing as good as it can possibly be in Cambridge. And I don't know, I feel like I've been talking for about 5 minutes. So I hopefully answered your question. I'm going to stop with that.
No, that was very helpful. And I wanted to have a quick follow-up with regard to the scenario you mentioned, where you cannot compel police officers to come and present evidence. Do you have some sort of arrangement with the police department where they will encourage their officers to voluntarily show up?
Well, in Cambridge, again, because we let them do the investigations in almost every case, they show up. I mean, they have to show up for professional standards. That's our internal affairs unit. So that they can do, and they will ask them very specific questions as part of an investigation in many cases, directed questions to elicit more information about the complaint and the incident and what happened. But I think then the chief probably could, not to put you on the spot, chief, but you could probably say a little bit more about the reasons for that and why that's something that communities may want and not get what they're looking for.
And from my perspective, the places that I worked, they didn't work with subpoena power, but it was a condition of employment. And by far, the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District was the most robust civilian oversight model that I work with. But that's coming out of that Bay Area where the city of San Francisco, the city of Oakland, the city of Berkeley's model is just, it makes ours look like when I was there, like a playground. And meaning that theirs was, they had been there for so much longer. And we were just beginning our civilian oversight when I became police chief. And what Mr. Core is referring to, subpoenaing an officer to come in and forcing them to make statements adverse to their interests in not affording them their constitutional rights. It's important that people understand we don't want the police to be above the law, but we don't want them to be below the law. And so this confidentiality becomes extremely important, that the officers are representative in these meetings, investigations. But again, what the organizations that I worked in, they did not have subpoena power. And it's just, and if you're talking about subpoenaing witnesses outside of the police department, like a business, getting videos, which are, you have media, some type of CCTV camera systems almost everywhere now. Our law enforcement agencies will go out and get that information on behalf of the civilian oversight groups that I've worked in. And again, they would be able to see it. And the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit System and the current system that I'm working in, where we have a civilian oversight at the University of Chicago, that civilian is not part of my chain of command. And that individual has the ability to compel my officers to come before that investigator and answer questions as a condition of employment. And any information that the civilian investigator may have trouble getting, my officers, detectives would go out and get it on their behalf. And we just have not I have not run into a situation where people refuse to cooperate.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. And I do have a couple of follow-ups. But you've mentioned a couple times being out in the Bay Area. I think it's going to be beneficial for the audience to understand the context in which you took over that position out there. There's a fairly high-profile case that some people may be aware about that took place prior to your arrival. Can you give us some color on that and share that with the audience?
Sure. In 2009, 2009, early the morning 2010, on January 1st, there was a shooting involving law enforcement officer from the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District, where he shot an unarmed Black man in the back on a crowded platform. And when I say crowded platform, the trains would move people on New Year's Eve night back and forth into the city of San Francisco to watch fireworks. So you had what we call crush load trains, where you have 1,000 people that witnessed this incident on this platform. I was not a part of the agency at the time. There have been many complaints about the organization prior to that. And when that incident took place, they ushered in a number of reforms, and they brought in the auditor, civilian review board with the investigator model. And I was selected to become the new police chief. They actually made a movie about the incident. It's called Fruitvale Station.
Thank you very much, Chief. And so on that line of questioning, just to clarify, did you have to deal with the civilian review board as a fallout of that situation, or was that before you arrived?
When I was selected and arrived, the civilian review board, all of those policies and recommendations changes were in place, but the civilian review board had not been selected yet. The independent auditor had not been selected yet. And so I was in place when all of that started to come up and be built. That model was built around me. And again, I'm not opposed to civilian oversight, so I saw this as an opportunity to create the change that the communities that we were servicing around the San Francisco Bay Area. The transit system goes through 5 counties, and they're moving 500,000 people a day just through this transit system. So there was cause for reform and high expectations as far as what they wanted from that law enforcement agency as they built this model, along with the Police Officer Association, which was, I thought at the time was unique, where each elected transit board member got a pick to put on their civilian review board, but also the police officers were able to select somebody to be on that review board to represent their perspective.
Chief Rainey,
Yes.
I have a quick question for you, just so I'm understanding and clear. Was the Oscar Grant case, was the civilian review board an effect of the Oscar Grant case? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I want to make sure.
All right. Now, I have some other questions to ask, and I have to admit they're not all coming from me. They're being filtered to me, but if they don't sound, if they sound brilliant, they're not my idea. If they sound stupid, it's my execution of the question, so I apologize. So this question can go to both of you. Let me start with Mr. Kaur first. Can you give us a sense of who are the best members to be a part of a review board? What part of the community that you come from? What that board should look like to sort of enhance trust between the community and the police agency?
Well, that is a very good and timely question. Now, I'll be honest, if you had asked me 3 years ago, I would have just given you a blanket, well, you need to have diversity, you need to have people with different types of some people who represent different backgrounds, and that's all true. And there's a couple other tangents I'll add in a minute. But I would say in the current moment we're living through, there are a lot of conversations about centering the experience of Black and brown people, people of color in general, more broadly marginalized communities, people who are dealing with mental health issues, the criminal justice system, people involved in that. So there are a variety of efforts right now to try to figure out models where you're appointing people on the recommendation of, say, different community organizations or community-based groups, different advocacy groups. So there's, and it's, to be honest, my personal opinion, it's unclear how that's all going to work out, because my personal perspective is very much what I shared before, and I think what you've also heard from Chief Rainey, that you really need all the stakeholders at the table. And increasingly, I'm seeing people say it really needs to be dominated by people who are the ones who are negatively impacted by policing. So in the theoretical world right now, it's a little in flux. But I would say it's less about what people where people come from or what their background is, as much as do you have people who are diverse, who can be impartial, who can be fair, who may have had negative experiences with the police and bring that to the table, who may have, say, in some places, you have people who are former law enforcement, you bring that to the table. But you have to bring those experiences and then be impartial. So people who can be fair, people who can be impartial, people who are willing to learn and read and do training. It isn't the kind of thing where you just come on the board and you're there and, you just kind of show up and whatever you think is great. You really do need some real training. And that's a very important part of this work, like any board, where you're really analyzing cases and making some sort of determination. The jury analogy is great in many ways because you're bringing a cross-section of the population. You have people from all walks of life. And you also are thinking about, is this someone who can be impartial in this case when they're put on a jury? It's not an exact analogy, but so I think that would be my answer. I know it's not a do this, this, and this, or get those three people, but that would be my perspective right now.
Chief Rennie, you want to tackle that question as well?
Sure. From my perspective, you want to bring people who have credibility. And credibility not just with your supporters, but with your critics. You don't want to establish an echo chamber that police are just great, we're not doing any wrong or anything like that. The more critics that you have, again, you have that creative tension. Because we in law enforcement have a tendency to use police and law enforcement jargon that most people don't understand. And by bringing your critics in and being transparent, it builds that trust, legitimacy, that respect that's necessary in order for us to infuse that community policing philosophy throughout our organization.
Thank you. On this issue of composition, I think we have a question from one of our subcommittee members. Captain Chamberlain, you want to jump on the camera and ask a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
On the lines of law enforcement former, not specifically from the agency that's being reviewed, do you have any recommendations on whether former law enforcement or someone with law enforcement experience is on the board itself?
I can certainly go first. In the Bay Area, they specifically would not take any former law enforcement officers on any of those, Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, or even BART. Specifically would not take anyone that was a law enforcement officer or a former law enforcement officer. Not saying it's right or wrong. Again, civilian oversight kind of like came from that area, and it's on steroids there. I mean, they are heavily involved, and rightfully so. From my perspective, each community is different. When you talk about how much money is being allocated to law enforcement organizations. And what we're being asked to do, that level of accountability, that layer of transparency, the innovation, that when you get a good, credible board, they can make that law enforcement agency so much better in order to deliver and meet the expectations of their communities.
And I don't have much to add other than you can look at it different ways. I've seen a number of boards where you have to have someone from law enforcement. I've seen boards where it's forbidden And in fact, right now, NACOL is doing some work with Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is engaged in a community process. They've committed to creating civilian oversight. They've done some work, and now they're getting feedback from the community. And people are really all over the map. So it's going to be interesting to see what they decide, because there are lots of good reasons to have someone with law enforcement experience, especially if there's someone who's not part of that agency that the oversight's happening for. They can explain things. There's lots that person can do, that perspective they bring. And then there are people who just feel that that's going to bring a bias that you can't avoid. And so it's really going to vary. My personal opinion, this is not the official NACOL position, is that I think in most cases it can be really helpful to have someone with law enforcement background. In fact, some of the people on the NACOL board are former sheriffs, police chiefs, police officers, and they're people who ended up working in civilian oversight. So I certainly think that people from a range of backgrounds can be fair and impartial, and it can be helpful. But there are definitely communities out there who would say, never, we're not going to have that. So it varies.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. I have an off-camera question coming from you. Ms. Patel, you want to jump in and ask your question?
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Mr. Core. Thank you, Chief Rainey, for being here today. I just have a quick question about the models that you've seen, and given the amount of training and hours that it would take for people to evaluate cases if they are to arise or when they do arise, is there consensus amongst the models regarding compensation for appointed members, or does it differ? Is it typically uncompensated? How does that look? Thank you.
Well, I guess I could try to answer this quickly. In general, in almost every case, it's uncompensated. I know there are a handful of boards out there, I couldn't tell you which ones, that do give people stipends. Some places will certainly cover, say, expenses for traveling to the office to read files. There are certain cities where no materials can leave the police department, so everyone has to find time to go there and review all their cases. But in general, it's something that is usually, like most city boards, city or community boards, city or county boards, they're volunteers. I think where you see people getting compensated are places where that's part of how things are done. And to the first part of your question, it depends on how many cases you're seeing, but it can take a lot of time to read through investigations and reports, especially if it's a large board. Now, many places that have bigger boards and more cases will have panels, so it won't be the entire board reviewing each complaint, so that there's some ability to spread the work around. And in terms of training, it's ongoing, but NACOL does a lot of training. We certainly recommend a lot of training on the front end, training from the law enforcement agency, training from NACOL. But then, as I said, ongoing training. NACOL has an annual conference. We usually have about 500 people. This year, we just finished doing it online over about 10 weeks. We had webinars 4 days a week for 10 weeks. So there are a lot of resources to train people. But generally, it's not paid. And generally, people are expected to put a significant number of hours in every month or even every week.
And my experience is the same. The actual civilian review boards are volunteers that are given a stipend if they're going away to training or something like that. But the auditor and investigators, that staff that stood up, those are paid employees of the jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Ms. Phillip, you want to jump on?
Sure. Hello. Thank you so much for speaking with us again today. I just have a question about training. So, Mr. Core, what type of training does your board go through, and is this ongoing training?
Okay, so I assume you're talking about the board where I work in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we have, I guess, 3 components of training. One is definitely training that is required for all boards and commissions in Massachusetts. So open meeting law, public records laws, things like that, ethics training. So those are, probably about once a year. We also have specific training, so people in our state, you have to have certain training to certify that you're able to look at potential what would be like criminal records, and that even involves some of the police reports that people see. The second area of training is training from the police department. So it's a combination of training on how they train their officers. So sort of an abbreviated use of force training, where we have our board members at least once a year go through there's a firearm simulator training. And that has multiple things. It's not just to teach people how to fire a gun. It's actually to teach people how to deal with scenarios and when to de-escalate and when not to de-escalate. They go through that training so they can better evaluate what the officers are doing. They also get training on some of the specialized units, homeless outreach, mental health. There's a lot of our complaints involve issues around homelessness, mental health, the nature of our city. And then the third thing is the training that NACOL provides. So as I haven't gone on too much detail, but we have a training conference where we provide training for people at any level in oversight. We have multiple tracks, so people who are brand new on an oversight board get appropriate training. People who are staff get appropriate training. And then in addition to that training conference, we do regional meetings a few times a year. They're sort of one-day trainings and discussions. We also do webinars, which now we've gotten really good at webinars. So I feel like I'm going on too long again. This is my long weekend day. I apologize.
You're fine. And you know what? What's happened is that the more you talk, the more questions you raise for you to answer. So I have a question that follows on what you're just saying with regard to the training. It sounds like a significant investment you're putting into people. And so typically, how long do members serve on these boards, given that kind of investment that's needed for them to learn how to be effective members? And also, are there term limits? Can you give me some color as to, at least from your experience, what you're seeing, what you guys do in Cambridge, and what you may have seen elsewhere?
Sure. I will work to be more rapid on this one. So it varies. That's definitely one of the things that varies immensely across the country. On my particular board, the members are put on for 5-year terms, and there's a limit of 2 terms. And now that is the longest term of any board at the city of Cambridge. The longest any other board is 3. And some don't have term limits, but the reason they're 5-year terms is that it was important when they drafted the ordinance. The drafters felt it was important that people, when they're put on, really get to stay on, that there's no undue pressure to kind of move along, that people really make a commitment to it. And as someone who's working with those people, I found it's really helpful to have people stay on because there is so much training and there's so much that people need to know about your own law enforcement agency, around the nature of civilian oversight, and people really get more experience over time. So I've got a couple of board members, 2 of my 5, whose terms are up at the end of next year. And I have to say, their second term, and I'm kind of dreading losing because we put so much effort into sending them to conferences and training and working with them. And so, let's see. I hope I answered the whole question.
I think you did as well. And so, Chief Rainey, we have more questions coming. We have 7 minutes left, so we'll make this quick. What's your perspective on and what you like to see in the training of boards members that have to, at some point in time, look at your officers and say, "Hey, officer, you may have done something wrong here." What do you expect to see from those citizens who are going to be looking at your doing oversight of your officers?
I expect them to exhibit those 13 principles that Mr. Cord talked about. Central to that is being fair, impartial, and thoughtful. But more importantly, they got to have credibility. And so as far as term limits and things along those lines, as long as the person who is appointed is credible and willing to invest the time, because it is a huge commitment, but it's so very, very important. You want to hold on to that person if possible, because you're basically taking them through a law enforcement career, depending on how often that they meet. There's some type of training component at every meeting. and then you set up training days on the weekend with our larger policy and procedures. So each jurisdiction is different, is unique. I don't know if I addressed your question or not.
Well, I mean, you have, but the base of my question is basically this: you've expressed the concern, and we've heard it elsewhere as well, with regard to, how can these folks judge me? They don't know what I do. They don't know my work, and so. From that perspective, what kind of training gives you more comfort they are at a good place to, judge what's happening or what your offices have done?
Again, if you establish a civilian review board, learn the policy and procedures, because if you're on a jury, any type of criminal or civil jury, that's what's going to be presented. And provide feedback. Do your reading ahead of time before the meetings so that you know what's going on. So if you see something, that's not right, because this is what their policies say, which are our guidelines. Nothing is like written in stone or anything like that. But again, if people know right from wrong, and if we are unable to convince a civilian review board, from my perspective, having them go on ride-alongs, going through use of force simulators, adding comments, signing off on new policy and procedures, looking at new technologies that we are talking about employing. For example, when facial recognition was first proposed in the Bay Area, the civilian oversight boards, they got very, very, very heavily involved in that, not just because the technology exists, but more so, should they? If they have credibility, they are tapping into the critics and bringing those concerns to the forefront, so you can have robust decisions, robust discussions, so we can get good decisions.
Thank you, sir, for your answer, and that was helpful. So to give you, you answered the question. Okay. Captain Chamberlain, I believe you have a question you wanted to raise.
So my question is for Chief Rainey. In regards to recommendations made by any of the 4 different oversight boards that you had the experience of working with, did any of those present a recommendation you did not agree with, and how did you handle those?
Yes, absolutely. And not just from the civilian oversight, but the auditor format, where the auditor was able to come into any investigation, whether it was regarding a citizen complaint or an internal investigation that was brought by a supervisor against an officer. And where we didn't agree, we would meet, discuss, and we would try to, I would try to make sure I understand his perspective at the time and present my perspective. We still didn't agree. The model was set up that the person that had the ultimate say was the general manager of the transit district, who was like the county administrator.
And what position did he take on that? He or she take on that?
The couple of times that we disagree, I think one time she went with what the auditor had to say, and one time she went with what I had to say. Again, it was nothing that was detrimental that I thought was going to more or less hurt the organization. It was just this really philosophical, and it was over how much discipline to give an employee. We both had a finding of sustained. There's 4 findings whenever there's an investigation for the audience. And when you sustain somebody, you basically said they've done something wrong, and the level of discipline being recommended. My discipline was, level of discipline was usually stronger than the auditor.
Is that because, I guess when you speak specific to discipline there, is that because you know what's fair from the historical perspective of what that discipline was issued?
And again, my auditor under the Bay Area was great. And I want to say that we approach discipline the same way. I look at the offense. I look at who the offender is. Do they have multiple disciplinary action? And then I look at what standard that I want to set, professional standard for my agency. And I take those three things in to account. There's some offenses, there's no coming back for. If you violate that, as far as say not telling the truth, not to mention there's a lot of debate going back and forth whether you can even continue to be a police officer. If you purposely, knowingly have lied and tried to cover something else, cover something up, I am going to terminate you. It's just, it's not up for discussion. But everything is not that clear, cut, and dry. So again, you look at the offense, the offender, somebody coming in late, a 10-year employee that's never been late, one of your best officers comes in late one day because something is going on where your brand new employee on probation comes in late and they tell you they overslept. Not a good sign. I'm going to handle those two situations differently by looking again at the offense, the offender, and then I'm going to do something because I want to set the standard for the agency that coming in late is unacceptable, but you have one person that has established a track record with you and another person who is trying to establish that track record, and again, coming in late, and I actually had this happen, somebody on their first day of work said they overslept. And and I look at it from all the people that I know from the law enforcement, that I was sitting out front waiting for the department to open up my first day. So it just didn't make sense. So
thank you so much.
And I know we're just getting close to the end. I'll just say very quickly that if you do end up in a system where you have different people making recommendations, whether it's a board or an auditor and a chief, that's a great place to have a disciplinary matrix. A lot of smaller departments don't have that, but then you want your auditor or your civilian oversight board to be using the same disciplinary matrix as the chief is using.
Thank you, Brian.
So, as is the case, we have more questions in the chat than we have time to address. And so what we may ask you to do is to graciously answer questions for us later on. But I want to thank you both very much for your time today and joining us and educating us and the rest of our community about civilian review boards and your perspectives on them. I know that the information you share with us has been very helpful in our endeavor to sort of learn more about them and figure out what's appropriate for Arlington. And I hope others who have viewed this have been as equally enlightened as we've been. And so, Chief Rainey, Mr. Kaur, thank you very much for your time.
thank you.
You're very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity.
And unfortunately, I have your number, so I'm going to probably reach out to you again. So just FYI. And so at this point in time, I want to basically wrap this session up. I want to thank everyone who's viewed it with us. I'm going to turn this back over to Mark before we wrap it up, but I want to let everyone know that in approximately 2 weeks, on the 26th, we're going to have a public stakeholder session where people who are outside of the PPG will have a chance to discuss this issue with us, the members of the subcommittee, about what they believe would be appropriate for our community. So invitations have gone out. If you receive one, please say yes and join us. You'll be able to view it for the rest of the community on the same channel as you're watching this now. And so I thank you all for your time. And Mark, the floor is yours.
Well, first, thank you, Rodney. I absolutely have just wanted to thank Chief Rainey And Mr. Kaur, you're both amazing. And I think given how well you perform, we're going to triple your pay for tonight. And we really thought it's great. We've learned so much from you, and we appreciate your taking the time and care. In Arlington, we're trying to do the best job we can, and it looks like we're learning from the best. And so for those of you who are listening, as Rodney said, there'll be an opportunity for members of the public to participate and ask their own questions. In the meantime, the Police Practices Group has a page up on our website. If you have questions, you don't have to wait till then. You can send them in, and we'll make sure that we include them in our decision matrix. And with that, I'm going to wish everybody a good evening. So thank you very much.